Hello, my name is Lucas. This is a bit of lit. And it's time to look at my wet hair because I refuse to dry my hair after a shower. And dry au naturel, you know? Anyway, it's time to talk about Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, by Edwin A. Abbott, who was a mathematician person who was in charge of, what was he? He was progressive educator, scholar, theologian, and prolific author, born in London. He got his degree from St. John's College, Cambridge, and was appointed assistant master at King Edward's School in Birmingham. And then he was the headmaster of the City of London School, where he was there from 1865 to 1889. He was very progressive in his views on studying English as opposed to Latin and Greek, and educating women, which is, great. And that's what I got from the introduction to this book. This book is incredible. I mean, it's not mind-blowing by any means. It's not sort of game-changing, but it is a social commentary book infused with this exploration of trying to understand what an added dimension would be like for a being. In this case, we have A square, kind of like we have A Abbott. And he is a lawyer in the two-dimensional world. And we learn a lot about how this world functions, the two-dimensional world, Flatland as it's called, and how women are basically lines, flat lines, and, the closer you are to being regular and equilateral, if you're an equilateral triangle, then you're doing all right for yourself. If you are an isosceles triangle, you're some kind of grunt worker and looked down upon. And, if you're equilateral triangle, the more generations there are, once you finally get to that stage, the more sides your children will have, and there's a reverence for your grandchildren as opposed to your grandfather, because they will be more advanced than you are. If you are a square, then okay, let's see. I forgot the words. If you're a square, then your grandchildren should, in theory, be hexagons, barring some irregularities. Anyway, the closer you are to being a circle, the more hexagons, the more sides you have. The closer you are to being a circle, the higher up you are in the social status. If you have many sides, you're a polygon. If you have so many sides it's indistinguishable, then you're just basically considered a square. And the way that they figure it out is sometimes through sight, sometimes through feeling, and depending on your class, it shows how you determine the shapes around you. The upper class would never, ever feel around. That would be highly offensive and below them. They are allowed to understand the world around them through sight, and the lower class is allowed, it feels around. Anyway, to get to the point where I'm just trying to build it up without spoiling too much, just to give you an idea of how this world is built. It is a speculative fiction book, science fiction, if you will, of a kind. Like I said, it's about being in the second dimension. In the first half of the book, it is very much a social commentary. We have a tour guide of the second dimension, A square, and then somewhere in the middle he meets this flat line that names himself king, and it's quite funny. This first dimensional being. and then he meets a sphere that is from the third dimension, and it transforms from being social, biting, scathing Victorian England satire, satire of Victorian England. I don't want to get into details how, so that you will read it and find out for yourself. But once he meets the sphere, it's more about trying to comprehend the idea of an extra dimension. In this case, for a square, he needs to come to terms with a third dimension. Of course, you can put yourself in his place and try to imagine a fourth dimension, which in this edition there is a sort of an afterword that goes into that, trying to understand that in a way. And it's really incredible, that transition. It's sort of an amalgamation of totally different ideas and totally different subject matters, but it works so well in this writing. And you know, it gives me something to chew on. The biting, scathing satire definitely feels relevant in some ways. Maybe it's not as relevant. Certainly, I mean, the chapter on the way the lower class, the isosceles triangles, are treated and considered and viewed by the equilateral triangles and squares such as a square and his brother, and pentagons and so on and so forth. I mean, just, man, the way that irregular shapes are viewed, just, it feels really relevant. And even the way that women in Flatland are viewed, perhaps a little more extreme than it is in America these days, but or in England, I guess. But how far off is it? Still, I don't know. You'll just have to read it and find out. Incredible book. And again, I really appreciate that sort of mind-bending examination of how to imagine a fourth dimension, or in this case, a third dimension, putting yourself in place. What a fourth dimension is, because a square tries to tell the sphere, like, surely if there's another dimension beyond my own, which you have shown me, which I did not believe at first, but now I am fully convinced of. There must be a fourth dimension, and the sphere is skeptical. He is quite skeptical about that. And, you know, he tries to reason with the sphere, and it is really an interesting, thought-provoking novel in that sense. What I really like about this is that this is from the perspective of a square, who is writing this when he's in prison, because he's tried to inform others about, you know, what he has seen, and he has no way to prove it, because the way, you know, he can't bring people into the third dimension, and he can't, bring other shapes into the third dimension. So the circles, who are sort of the clergy or whatever, the highest top dogs, they're not buying it, and he can't make a diagram that would make any sense to them, because they only see lines, which has me wondering, like, wouldn't their eyes, which are on their sides, can they have sides if they're in the second dimension? I would think no, because that would involve them having height, not just width and depth, I suppose, but they would have to have height. And couldn't you just, if it has no third dimension, you could easily just put things through a second dimensional being, right? I mean, am I wrong? I don't know. I mean, he does sort of go into this vaguely with the sphere, but anyway, a square is in prison because he decides to try and tell people of his adventures, and he has no way to make a diagram to show what he's talking about when he mentions a cube, and he has no way of showing them like the sphere could, because he is a two-dimensional being, not a three-dimensional being like the sphere. And so he's in prison, and he starts to lose his belief in what he's seen. And he's, yeah, it is really interesting to have that dimension, so to speak, in the book. That's all I've got to say. Really, I could rave on, but I will pretty much say the same things. And I don't want to be too much of a spoil sport, even though I did mention what happens at the end of the book. Let me know what you think. If you've read this, let's move it over here. Then let me know. I think it's an incredible, thoughtful exploration of social satire and speculative fiction. Thank you. Goodbye.